Greetings YouTubers, my name is PhD Tony and today I'm going to be taking aim at a particular purveyor of anti-science rhetoric, Steven Crowder. For those of you fortunate enough not to know who Steven Crowder is, he's a professional internet troll and right-wing apologist. All of which is fine, he can do what he wants to do, as long as he refrains from offering ill-informed and misleading commentary on issues of science that he knows nothing about. The fact that this video is being made suggests that he did not follow that simple life rule. As you may or may not recall, in November 2021, world leaders gathered in Glasgow, Scotland for COP26, a summit on how the world might best address the threat of climate change. Mr. Crowder took this opportunity to make a presentation of his own in which he argued that climate change simply isn't a problem and everyone should just ignore it. My response to his presentation will be presented in two parts. In this first part, I will discuss the science that Steven Crowder gets wrong, and in the second part, I will focus on the ethics of climate change, or more specifically, why climate denialism is grotesquely immoral. Returning our attention to Mr. Crowder's presentation, he chooses to open this episode with what he obviously imagines to be a blisteringly scathing satire of climate activism.
Climate changes. Hey everyone, welcome to Climate Changers. My name's Alfonso Blue.
And I'm Alicia Green.
Today we're going to be talking about the rising temperatures of our planet Earth.
Rising temperatures? But it's not even that hot out. I'm even wearing this jacket.
I'm going to come back to this point a few seconds later in the presentation, but I do want to make the point just now. Climate is not weather.
I'm even wearing this jacket.
Okay, bigot. Sure you don't want to be at a Trump rally right now? Just kidding. We all know Alicia loves science, but temperature can be deceiving, so let's take you through it. Yeah! Did you know that according to our very own scientists at NASA, that our planet's temperature has been increasing by 0.13 degrees Fahrenheit per decade? That's almost 0.015 degrees Fahrenheit per year.
That is simply not the rate at which global mean surface temperature is currently rising. While the words were chosen with great care to avoid stating anything that was outright false, the presentation nonetheless succeeds in being spectacularly misleading. In order to obtain the value of 0.13 degrees Fahrenheit per decade, one needs to take the entire increase in global mean surface temperature since 1860 and divide that number by 16. But as we can see from this diagram, that's by no means a good approximation of what's actually going on with global mean surface temperature. In fact, we can see that the rate of increase in global mean surface temperature has increased dramatically throughout this period. If we restrict our attention to the last 4 decades, during which the rate of increase in global mean surface temperature has been reasonably constant, we can see that the rate of increase in global mean surface temperature is in fact 0.32 degrees Fahrenheit per decade, almost 2.5 times higher than the value claimed in Mr. Crowder's fatuous skit. But this astonishing, simultaneous demonstration of moral turpitude and scientific illiteracy is by no means finished.
Our planet's temperature has been increasing by 0.13 degrees Fahrenheit per decade? That's almost 0.015 degrees Fahrenheit per year.
I do love the planet and science, but that just doesn't sound like a lot to me.
The second point to be made here is that even if the figure of 0.13 degrees Fahrenheit per decade were correct, it's still an insanely fast rate of increasing global mean surface temperature. The actual rate being double that just makes the problem even more alarming. The basic problem here is the one I alluded to earlier. Altogether now, climate is not weather. Changes in temperature and precipitation that occur over a number of hours, days, months, seasons, years, is all weather. Weather governs how you choose your clothing, as referenced by the young lady in the presentation. In contrast, climate is average conditions that prevail over the course of 30 years or more. And people who know what they're talking about will be very careful to restrict their attention to periods of 30 years or more. Because a prerequisite for commenting on climate is knowing what climate is. While weather dictates what clothing you wear, climate dictates what conditions your infrastructure needs to operate in and remain effective, where you build your cities and what conditions they are designed to withstand. the frequency, intensity, and duration of storm events, and the defences that need to be constructed to protect your infrastructure from their effects, what food crops you can grow and where you can grow them, what livestock you can raise and where you can raise them, how much water you have available for domestic use, industry, and agriculture, how you transport it and how you store it. And this is a problem because rapid and large-scale changes to climate can mean that the infrastructure that your society relies on may no longer be fit for purpose. You may not be growing the right crops in the right fields. Your irrigation may not be sufficient. Your dam levees may not be strong enough. And once your infrastructure has stopped being effectively functional, your society becomes vulnerable to the impacts of climate. So by publicly advocating inactivity in response to climate change, you are putting hundreds of millions of lives and livelihoods at risk. I'm not exactly certain when the conservatives of the world decided to be collectively lobotomized and all of a sudden decide that prevention is not better than cure. However, this spectacularly delusional piece of groupthink was accomplished. It's just plain wrong. There are a great many conditions for which there is no cure, and prevention is economically, morally, and intellectually the best strategy. It is vastly better to avoid the adverse consequences of climate change than to let them happen. Having completely squandered the opportunity to prevent anthropogenic climate change from occurring, we are now faced with the expense and inconvenience of having to upgrade our infrastructure. This not only represents a significant drain on the public purse, it's also going to take a lot of time. And if we don't stop emitting greenhouse gases, we're only going to have to do it all over again in a couple of decades. Yet again, I'm utterly mystified how modern conservatives consider themselves fiscally responsible, but insist on pissing mountains of public money away on these utterly avoidable expenditures. But let's get back to the main point. One of the biggest differences between climate and weather is what constitutes a major change. We are very used to moderate changes in temperature occurring over the course of a day or a season. The changes that are being discussed in terms of climate seem a lot smaller. So why are people making a big fuss about them? Well, what constitutes an apparently small change in climate is actually a big deal. We can see from this figure that most places on Earth will experience a temperature change of at least 10 degrees between day and night. Similarly, between summer and winter, most of the Earth experiences a change in excess of 10 degrees Celsius. When we look at changes in global mean surface temperature, however, we see that they're very small and generally quite slow. And yes, there is an increase over the past 150 years, but how do we know that that's unusual or alarming? Well, looking at the data for the past 2,000 years, we can clearly see that the modern period is quite unusual in its behaviour. It seems to be going in one direction, and it seems to be moving there very, very fast. Now, admittedly, we're talking about temperature proxies rather than direct instrumental observations, but even so, the resolution of our data does not permit the conclusion that the modern era is typical of how climate has behaved previously. We can similarly analyse temperature records for the past 20,000 years, and again we see that the modern era is unusual. It is not typical for temperature increases this sustained and this large to occur according to the temperature data we have. As we can see, the last glacial maximum, which was about 20 to 22,000 years ago, was only 7 degrees cooler in terms of global mean surface temperature than pre-industrial conditions. But a 7-degree change in global mean surface temperature was sufficient to form ice sheets thousands of kilometres thick over large portions of North America and Northern Europe. So that we can more easily visualise this, here's a schematic illustration of ice thickness compared to the skylines of several US cities. This example illustrates that what seems like a very modest change in temperature when viewed from the perspective of weather is actually an incredibly profound change when viewed from the perspective of climate. We should also note that the 7-degree warming that occurred after the last glacial maximum occurred over a period of 7,000 years. So normally, changes in global mean surface temperature are relatively small in amplitude and occur quite slowly. In short, all of the paleoclimatic data we have tells us that what we observe in the modern era, a relatively large and very, very sudden change in global mean surface temperature, is not at all normal or natural and can have very profound effects on all sorts of environmental systems. So having addressed those points, let's return to Mr. Crowder's presentation. The rest of that particularly stupid skit is utterly valueless and I won't spend any more time on it. Having dispensed with the preambles, Mr. Crowder gets down to business and takes aim at predictions that have been made in regard to the effects of climate by various celebrities. And in doing so, he perpetuates two myths. One, that the utterances of celebrities are somehow significant as far as science is concerned. And two, that climate predictions are easy to interpret. It's this latter point that I want to address. Everybody thinks they understand how to assess the accuracy of a scientific model. You look at the prediction, you compare it to the results of your observation, and you need the prediction and the result to agree very closely, otherwise the prediction is wrong. But this doesn't work for any system that has a significant random component. Let's consider the example of predicting the results from rolling 3 six-sided dice. In this case, we can predict every possible outcome. And we can determine that the average outcome from rolling 3 six-sided dice is 10.5. So that's our best prediction for what's going to happen when we roll 3 six-sided dice. But that's never going to be correct. It's always going to be wrong, and sometimes it's going to be wrong by upwards of 70%. So our best model of what's actually going to occur is never going to be what we observe. And this extends to all systems that have some form of random component. And global mean surface temperature certainly has several randomized drivers on timescales of years to decades. For instance, this apparent plateau in global mean surface temperature from 1945 to 1970 was caused by an increase in aerosol emissions. These resulted from the ending of rationing after World War II and the increased burning of coal and fuel. Aerosol production is highly random. It varies with production techniques, public policy, and the technologies available. So highly random effects such as aerosol production make it very difficult to produce a single, accurate climate prediction. The way people work around this is by adopting a strategy similar to that adopted for the case of 3 six-sided dice. In that case, however, we could consider every possible combination of parameter values. In the case of climate, we can't do that. So what we do is we adopt a very wide range of variable values in different combinations and hope that we've covered our bases. This is called a model ensemble. If it turns out in a previous analysis we didn't cover a broad enough range of parameter values, then we extend our parameter search in subsequent analyses. Usually when we want to represent our results in a single figure, rather than presenting all of the model results, we just take the average of all of the models. So when you see a figure like this is not the authors saying, this is what's going to happen. This is the authors saying, we ran a bunch of models and this is representative of the general pattern of those models. So what Mr. Crowder and his climate denialist ilk like to do is take individual predictions, pretend that there are no random processes involved in the outcome, and ignore all context and model uncertainty. This is an absolutely unfair and scientifically illiterate way in which to assess climate model accuracy. So, to review what we've covered so far, Mr. Crowder lied about the rate of increase in global mean surface temperature. He doesn't know the difference between climate and weather, and he has no idea how to assess climate predictions. In short, Mr. Crowder has nothing of value to say on the subject of climate or climate science. So why does he make a point of vomiting these asinine, inaccurate, and irresponsible inanities into the public discourse? Well, prepare yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, because he's about to explain himself.
Okay, I know that a lot of you are going to say, hey, wait a second, you're not a scientist. That's absolutely true. And neither are you.
Well, in fact, yes, I am. And more than that, I'm a scientist with specific training in climate physics. But even if I weren't, this line of argument makes absolutely zero sense. So what you're saying is that it's okay to say factually incorrect, dangerous and irresponsible things, but only if your audience is completely clueless about how little you know. It's like saying that it's okay to punch people as long as those people can't defend themselves. It's gibbering nonsense of the highest order. In my experience, the vast majority of people imagine themselves to be sufficiently qualified in climate science that they have meaningful contributions to make about the public discourse relating to anthropogenic climate change. For the most part, they are simply wrong. Most people do not have an adequate background in physical sciences, and even those that do not have the training specific to climate science necessary for their comments to be meaningful. So here's a novel concept. If you don't have specific training in a scientific discipline, don't comment on it, because you don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Crowder will doubtless play the venerable "I was only kidding" defense, where he was just attempting to make comedy and any serious criticism of what he was saying is inappropriate. It's a tried and true tactic of right-wing trolls the world over. The only problem with this defense is climate denialism isn't funny. It's completely morally bankrupt, and that isn't funny. That's why you so rarely see climate scientists publicly correcting celebrity climate activists, because what the celebrity activists are doing is not immoral. What the climate denialists are doing is. So that's where I might call a halt today. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate it. And I hope you'll join me next time for a deep dive into the ethics of climate change, or the profound immorality of climate denialism.